My name is Carl Sisson, for those of you who I don't know, and I'll just say I'm Carter's dad. That's the easiest for some. It's good to have you here. This is the second Best Talk of this semester, and it's a privilege for me. I'm going to introduce our guest who has come all the way from Denver, Colorado, in order to share from his vocational journey with you. And he and I both want this to be a time where you have an opportunity to ask some really good questions of him. So be thoughtful as Mr. Barnes is talking today, and hit him with your best questions. So he has already had an opportunity today to interact with some of you in class with Dr. Mylander, some of our pre-law students with Dr. Esch. He's been in chapel, and the thing that he has said to me, I appreciate the level of questions, the inquisitiveness of our students. So continue to prove that tonight, and that would be great. So Will Barnes, who was in the Houghton College class of 1980, is a highly experienced business leader and a corporate lawyer, having served 12 years on senior executive leadership teams. In his role as business executive and corporate lawyer, he led companies through mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, strategic relationships, turnarounds, and execution of growth strategies. He led the repositioning of companies in their markets, including developing strategy. Will carries strong experience in risk management, governance, as well as ethics and compliance. His industry experience includes healthcare, insurance, and employee benefits, derived from progressive roles at profit and nonprofit organizations, ranging from mid-sized company to Fortune 50 companies. He served for 25 years as a corporate leader and as an attorney. After attending Houghton, Will received a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration from Messiah College before earning a law degree and an MBA from Syracuse University. He has 20 years experience serving on boards of directors, including a privately held company and for several nonprofit organizations. Will and his wife Jane reside in Denver, Colorado, where they enjoy skiing, hiking, and kayaking. She sings choral music and plays a classic rock guitar. That's pretty cool. Will continues to do some mountain climbing, a sport that he took up while he was a student here at Houghton. So please help me welcome tonight's Best Talk speaker, Will Barnes.
Thank you, Carl, for that kind introduction. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm pleased to have an opportunity for us to talk and to share with you my journey through my career.
If not, do the arrow on my laptop right there on the right. All right, let's do this.
There we go. Is it further down arrow?
Not going to work. Nothing to it.
Okay, very good. All right, technical difficulties solved. Today I'm going to walk through my personal journey and then share with you my experience in working as in-house counsel and share some of the dynamics of that role. And then we'll have time for a conversation. Of course, conversation is two-way, so I really look forward to your questions and comments and challenges. What I say tonight is my experience. It's not carved in stone. People have different perspectives than I do, so we can discuss that. As I look back on my journey, my professional journey, I realized that our professional journey is part of our life journey. Our career journey is not separate. When I started out, I saw my career journey as being a journey that ran in parallel with my family journey, my church and ministry journey, that these were all somehow separate and progressing. And I came to understand it's all one and all intertwined. And so I'll talk about the whole journey, and I'll follow the journey starting with growing up all the way through to my recent retirement. I was very fortunate to grow up in a Christian home with very strong role models, especially my dad and my grandfather. I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian tradition that had a very low emphasis on education and scholarship, and had a bit of a separatist culture, which I found somewhat limiting. So I really felt a desire to go to a place where I could safely challenge that, where I could safely test what I was raised with and really form my own faith. I became a Christian as a child, so I had an immature faith. I wanted to be able to challenge that and grow, but do that in a place where I had a solid foundation. And that's why I wanted a Christian college and came here to Houghton. My college years were really a time of broadening horizons. You know, I came out of a high school in a small town. Now I'm interacting with people from different places. I really grew academically, I grew personally, I grew spiritually. And it was in college that I really began to explore how my faith interacted with the rest of life. How did my faith play a role in my vocation? How does it play a role in our society? How do I live out that faith? And what does it mean? I decided to go on to law school and become a lawyer. But I did not decide that until my junior year. Many people, if not most people who go to law school, make that decision much earlier. In fact, I was talking with peers at the time who were just stunned. I had just decided to go to law school because they knew that for years and years. That was what they were going to do. But that was kind of my path. That was my decision point. And what I would encourage you is that your path may have decision points that don't fit what everybody else thinks is the norm, and you shouldn't worry about that. You should follow your path. After law school, I went into private practice. I worked in law firms and had a focus on general business law and financial transactions. I practiced in private practice for some time, and then made a shift into working in management roles with hospitals and physician organizations. That brought out some of the business side of me, and then after some time there, I had the opportunity to go in-house with a large insurance company. So I moved from those management roles to being an in-house lawyer in a large company, and that was a real growth process, a real change. I learned a lot about the dynamics of working in-house. I learned about corporate culture. Every corporation has one. I think larger companies have more complex cultures, but I learned the practice considerations of working in-house, which was very different from what I had done in private practice. After 8 years, I shifted. I had the opportunity to become a general counsel. That's to be the top lawyer of the company. That opportunity came after I had relocated for a promotion within the large company I worked for. My wife and I relocated 4 times with my career, all across state lines. That's a big decision, changing jobs and changing companies is a big decision. When you couple that with uprooting, moving to a place you haven't lived before, leaving a church that you're comfortable with, and trying to reestablish, that's very disruptive. So if you have those opportunities, or as sometimes happens, if you're pressured to do that, I would encourage you to really think about it carefully and pray about it and weigh whether that is the direction you should go. Fortunately, after everything, my wife and I looked back and we talked about it and we said, yeah, that was the right decision. Which is good, because if it hadn't been, that would have been a hard conversation to have with my wife. But as a result of that, my career advanced. We had the opportunity to live in some very different and interesting places and take advantage of what was unique to those places. And my wife really advanced her singing skills, which is not her vocation, but in many ways it's her calling. So we certainly benefited from that. 2 years ago, I retired. In fact, 2 years ago, right about now. I'm a little surprised it's already been 2 years. But I have now entered into what many people call the third of life, and that is kind of from age 60 on. And I'm finding it's a very rewarding time. I now chair the board of a Christian ministry in Denver, and I just joined the board of a second ministry. I have a lot more time and flexibility for that work, and I have the availability to do that without all the demands that I had when I was in my career and working. And that's a great benefit. Now, as I look back on that career journey, there are a couple takeaways that I have. As I've reflected on that, I've realized, your career path does not have to be etched in stone early. Your career path can shift. Mine shifted and took several major turns. If you had asked me when I graduated from law school, what do you think about health law as a career? I would have said, no, there isn't much there. Not where I'm going to go. I'm going to be a financial transactions guy. Turned out that was a very rewarding career. Things changed. We live in a very dynamic environment. The business and social environment is dynamic. The legal environment is dynamic. As changes occur, it's very important to be adaptable. And as changes in my environment and the kind of work available in Denver changed, I made those shifts and ultimately had a very rewarding time. The other thing to keep in mind as you plan for your career and as you enter into it and execute on it is that your career path is unique to you. I think there might have been a time when you could get a degree in a certain subject area, go to work for a company, and someone would sit down with you and say, here's the kind of work you'll do, and when you're good enough, you get promoted, and this is what you'll do, and you can get that promotion, and this will be your progression through your career. If that ever existed, I think it's long gone. So you will chart a path throughout the course of your career, and it's not going to look like everybody else's, and you will find at times it does not look like what some people think it ought to. And you have to remember that this is your journey, and it's one that you need to execute in a way that works for you and that meets your expectations. And I'll just touch again on adaptability. That's I think one of the key skills for an in-house lawyer is adapting as things change. During my time as an in-house lawyer, we had two major legal changes within the health insurance industry. The first was the Health Insurance Portability and Affordability Act, HIPAA, the Major Privacy Act, which did not exist when I graduated from law school, and which suddenly created a whole new set of rules that touched on virtually every transaction that we did. Everything that touched on our customers' information now fell into that regulation. That was a huge change. We had to adapt to that. The in-house lawyers had to learn it, first of all. Our job was to figure out what's there, figure out what's required of us, and then work with the business people to change our processes so we comply. The second major change was when the Affordable Care Act was passed, commonly known as Obamacare, which made major changes to the health insurance industry. I was the general counsel of a health insurer then. I found myself neck deep in figuring out what was required of this 2,000-page law and the 10,000 pages of regulations that followed it, working with the business to understand what we needed to do to comply with that. And in my spare time, while I was serving on the board of an organization that provided employee benefits, including a medical plan, to a group of churches, I had to work with that board and that organization to figure out what that meant for a self-funded employer benefit plan. So I was really working it from both ends. And it was a very interesting, although at times somewhat taxing and tiring time. But that adaptability allowed me to thrive through all of that. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk more about what it is like to work in-house as a lawyer. If you go into law, you have a number of different avenues you can take. And by the way, none of them will look very much like what you see on the lawyer TV shows. So try not to set your expectations on that. But going into law, the most common direction is to go into private practice, to work with a law firm, to practice there. In-house is another opportunity where you're employed by an organization and you work exclusively for them. But in-house isn't all the same. You could be in-house for a corporation, a nonprofit, a government entity. Government lawyers are really in-house lawyers, and they play an important role. At some point in your career, depending on the path you take, you may have the opportunity to serve as a judge. That's a very different career path, and again, a very important one. And some lawyers take the skills they've learned in law school and the skills they've learned practicing, and they go outside the law entirely, and they pursue career paths where they no longer practice law. Now, for some people, that just is a strange direction, because those folks have invested all that time in law school and all that money, and they've worked so hard as lawyers, and now, they're not going to do it anymore. But the truth is, as you practice, you'll gain a lot of skills that can be used outside law, and if you see a satisfying career path there, you'll have the skills to follow it. Just make a note that the second most common degree among corporate CEOs is a law degree. MBA is the most common, law degree is number 2. Those folks aren't practicing anymore, but most of them have very rewarding careers. As I looked at my practice, I was working in-house, one of the things that I thought about and sometimes wrestled with was, how does my work fit in the kingdom of God? What is the role of my work as an in-house lawyer in the kingdom of God? Now, if you work for a religious organization, that's pretty clear. If you're in the private sector, in the commercial world, it's not as clear, and for much of my career, it wasn't talked about much. So I found myself working in fairly large organizations where my client was not an individual, not a person, but a corporate entity. And I asked myself, so is this anything more than just earning a paycheck to cover my living expenses? But as I did some reading in that area, I came to understand that commerce is important to God. Commerce was created by God. When God gave humans dominion over the earth, that was not just the authority for us to exercise, but also a responsibility as to how we use that authority. Commerce is one way that we meet people's basic needs. That is where we produce the goods and services that people need and execute the transactions that move those goods and services to them. In-house lawyers are part of that exercise of dominion, and we should do our work, therefore, to the glory of God. I think another important role of in-house attorneys is our role as peacemakers and the voice of conscience. There's a tremendous amount of conflict in our culture now. There's a lot of conflict in business. It just happens. But one of the things that we can do as in-house lawyers is to reduce that conflict and to better manage it. One of the ways I work to reduce conflict was when I was drafting a contract for a business transaction, I worked hard to really understand that transaction, to understand the business elements of the transaction, the business purposes of the transaction, and to draft a contract that was clear enough that if a disagreement arose, the contract would spell out how it would be handled and would clearly articulate the roles and responsibilities of the parties, so there would be no need, or at least less of a need, to litigate. When disputes do occur, the first reaction, which may just be human nature, is to defend what we've done, and the second reaction is to attack the other party. That's what gives rise to a lot of our litigation. One thing in-house lawyers can do is work to address those conflicts and to look for ways to resolve them, not only without the time and expense of litigation, but without the damage to the relationships, either business relationships or personal relationships. Nobody really resolves a conflict through litigation. Litigation is just more about getting as much as you can. And typically you come out of litigation, certainly major litigation, with the underlying relationship either badly damaged or completely destroyed. That can have a lot of follow-on negative consequences. So the work that we can do to resolve a conflict in a way that allows the relationships to continue is quite valuable. We're also in a position to serve as the voice of conscience when decisions have to be made. The Scripture tells us not all things that are legal are good. And that's quite true. It's true in business. Certainly our role as counsel is first to articulate for the business what the law allows us to do, what the law prohibits us from doing. But everything that we're allowed to do is not beneficial. And there are times when a follow-on conversation is very productive if we can move from just what is legally permissible to what the best solution is. That takes us back to values. Every company should have an articulated set of values to guide decision making. I have appealed to that in conversations about the best path forward within what was legal, and had conversations about what was best for everyone involved, certainly our customers. Christian lawyers aren't the only ones with consciences. We don't speak alone in that conversation, but that's a very valuable conversation that we can engage in. One of the reasons in-house practice is important is the complexity of business. We're in a more and more regulated society. We're more polarized. We have higher levels of conflict. Transactions that we used to see as fairly simple are no longer so simple. And good legal guidance can do a lot, not only to advance the company's strategy, but to save the company from the side effects of those conflicts. And in the secular world, employee relationships are more complex, and good guidance is necessary there. Now, I came out of private practice and went in-house, and there are both similarities to practicing in both settings and some real differences. Really, I think the biggest similarity is whether you're in-house or outside, the need for quality legal advice and services is the same. Companies look to in-house lawyers for good quality work. They're not looking for lesser quality just because you're in-house. Relationship skills are equally important. In private practice, you have to have good relationships with your clients. When you're in-house, your clients aren't really clients, they're your business partners, they're your colleagues and your coworkers, and you have a different kind of relationship, but it's very important to build those relationships and maintain them. And I think the need for continuous learning is the same. You always have to be advancing your knowledge base and your skill set, because you're always going to need new skills. There are some very real differences. Working in-house, you're very much a part of the business. When I was in private practice, businesses came to us for specific needs, and we worked as a consultant to them. We were their legal consultants. When I was in-house, I was not a consultant, I was a part of the team. I wasn't just supposed to give legal advice, I was to advance the company's business objectives. I think that best played out when I changed jobs once, and I sat down with the CEO of the company I just joined, and I said, okay, what's the number one thing you want from me as general counsel? And she just looked at me and said, grow the business. We have to grow this business, and it's your job to help us do that. And of course, to do it in a legally compliant manner. But she didn't say, you know, I just want a lot of good legal answers from you. It was very much, you're part of the business. It's your job to help us succeed. Another difference is very different difference in scope. Often in private practice, over time, lawyers develop specialties. They become much more expert in specific areas. That's really valuable, and for us as in-house counsel at their time, we really need expert outside counsel. But in-house, we have to cover everything. When I was general counsel, my job was to handle any legal issue that came up. Whether I took care of it myself, someone on my team took care of it, or we brought in outside counsel, it was mine to solve. As a result, I had to learn to identify a broad range of issues, identify them quickly and well enough to be able to quantify them and get the right people on it. There's sometimes a joke that in-house counsel are an inch deep and a mile wide. There's some truth to that because we've got to cover the whole territory, but we have to know more than just an inch deep about the issues that affect our company. One of the big differences that I learned very quickly was the difference in identity. When I was with a law firm, it was the law firm that was on my business card. We actually had business cards then. But on my email signature line, it wasn't my client's name, it was the law firm's name. When I went in-house, it was the company. I was now professionally identified with my company. And for better or for worse, I carried that everywhere I went. In social settings, if somebody said, "What do you do?" I work with this insurance company. I worked with a large insurance company. Sometimes people would say, "Oh, I have your insurance." It's not, I get insurance from somebody you give advice to. I have your insurance. And I would always just tighten up a little bit and say, "So, what kind of a job are we doing for you?" And sometimes I got a pat on the back, and sometimes I got a face full of complaints. I sometimes went back to the office after those conversations, called somebody up and said, "We really need somebody to reach out to this person because I don't think we're taking care of them." But what they came away from, it was Will Barnes' company. And that, of course, reflected on me. Another difference is your basic relationships with the business people. Shortly after I went in-house, I was sitting in my office working one afternoon, and a person walked in, sat down, and started talking to me. And I looked up and I thought to myself, I didn't see an appointment on my calendar. Because when I was in private practice, if somebody wanted to come see me, they called the firm and they made an appointment. In-house, they just walked in because I'm the lawyer. And they got a question. So I worked with my clients, not by appointment, but sometimes riding the elevator in the morning, getting a cup of coffee downstairs. I saw them in the cafeteria. I sometimes saw them more than I wanted to. They sometimes saw more of me than they wanted to, but it's a very different relationship dynamic. And the other big change was I became part of business decisions. I was expected to contribute not only good legal advice, but also to engage in the business aspects of our decisions. So what are the keys to success? I think the number one thing is if you go in-house, you have to know the business. And you have to know it as well as the business people. You have to know the company's markets, its products. You have to know who you compete with. And this is not quick or easy. If you don't have a business background, there are tools that you can use to gain that knowledge. That was one of the reasons I got an MBA while going to law school, was to get that basic knowledge. But then had to spend a lot of time making sure I knew the company. And a lot of time making sure I knew the company's financial statements and its finances. They're key to a lot of business decisions, and financial statements are often the basis of some real legal problems. So you have, if you're going to work in-house, and especially if you're going to rise within the ranks in-house, you have to be able to understand the company's financials. In my roles as general counsel, I was one of the corporate officers who signed the financial statements we filed with state regulators. So every quarter, I signed an attestation to our regulators that our financial statements were accurate. You really can't do that if you don't understand what you're signing, or you really shouldn't. So it was important to have that knowledge. And I would always review them and often call our chief financial officer if I had questions and talk through things until I was comfortable that I was putting my signature on something that was accurate. The people who used to be my clients when I was in private practice became my business partners when I went in-house. And I mentioned how much more I saw of them. Well, it became really important to develop those relationships because I was going to work with these people day in and day out. I worked a lot with transactions in private practice, and sometimes if I was dealing with somebody who was hard to work with, I just remind myself, we finished this transaction, we're done with this client, I won't have to deal with them anymore. But in private practice, if somebody was hard to deal with, I think they might be here another 10 or 20 years, and it's going to be day after day. I have to learn how to work with them. And hopefully they understand they should learn how to work with me. One of the things I also really emphasized was being close to the business operations. And I think that's one of the greatest advantages of in-house counsel. We worked with the business people very regularly. I worked to assign attorneys to specific operational departments so they knew how that department operated, how they did what they did, and they had good relationships with those folks. That allowed us to enter the conversations much earlier and in much productive ways. If people only call you when something's wrong, then when you sit down in a conference room, everybody gets a bit defensive. But if you know them and you work with them on a regular basis, there's a good chance they'll come to you first. In one company, I hired a lawyer who had really good litigation experience. And so I assigned him to our claims payment department because that generated most of our litigation. He developed really good relationships with them. And so people just started to call him and say, "Hey, John, could you come over here and look at this?" And he would give them good guidance along the way. He also knew our operations well enough that when we got sued, he could work very effectively with our outside counsel to resolve those lawsuits quickly. The result was we got sued less because of the upfront advice, and when we were sued, it cost us less and took less time to resolve it. And our list of pending litigation just got shorter and shorter as we adopted that approach. I want to touch on a couple of the key relationships that you have in-house. So I was in the legal department. I was the general counsel. Most companies also have a compliance department and an internal audit department. These are three functions that need to work together closely and work in sync. Doesn't always happen, but to be effective, you need well-coordinated work from those three departments. So those of us in the legal department were to be the subject matter experts on the law, what is required of the company. The compliance department bridged that with operations and spent a great deal of time and effort working with our operations areas to implement our advice and our direction on what the law required so that we embedded legal compliance in our operations. So we had regular operating procedures that would keep us in compliance with the law. You'll find a lot of lawyers working in compliance for that reason. People who had been in law will shift over there. It's a natural transition. Internal audit is an auditing function. They come in after the fact and come in and review and check whether we are still operating in a way that's compliant. And that's very valuable information. I used to have regular meetings with our chief compliance officer and our head of internal audit for the three of us to sit down under the attorney-client privilege because I was general counsel and say, okay, what are we seeing that concerns us? What are we seeing that we ought to focus on because it may develop into a problem? And let's go look at it now. Now certainly, and you'll learn this when you get into business, nobody looks forward to a visit from internal audit or the compliance department. Like that's usually the last thing people want to see come up on their calendar. But I used to remind folks, it's a lot easier to have a conversation with me or one of our compliance folks or one of our internal audit folks than to have a conversation with a regulator who's investigating us or to have your deposition taken in a lawsuit. Because really, we're a whole lot more friendly than those other two. And we'll do a lot with you to make your life a lot easier. Now, nothing works perfectly, and the balance between legal compliance and business strategy doesn't work perfectly either. One of the things you have to understand is your company's goals and the company's culture. You have to understand their risk culture and their risk appetite. And that can really be variable. In some industries, companies don't want any risk. They want to button everything down real tight. In other businesses and other industries, it's more about speed to market, getting the product out there, getting sales going. And in some companies, it's pretty much all about profit and everything else kind of falls in behind that. And even within a company, you will find different parts of the company and different people have different approaches to risk. You have to be able to have those conversations about what the risks are, to the extent you can, quantify them, and work toward the balance that works for the company and its strategies and still keeps you compliant. As soon as you think you've reached that, something will change. And you will work on this your entire career. It's just one of the dynamics of being in-house. So I've talked a lot about working with the business. I want to shift over and talk a little bit about what the business wants from us. And I'm going to look at this from the standpoint of the general counsel, the top lawyer who runs all the legal function. What CEOs want is not just someone to answer legal questions and produce legal documents. They want someone who can be a business partner, a part of the leadership team, and who can contribute to the company's strategy. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to attend a seminar with the National Association of Corporate Directors that is about just that. The title of the seminar is The General Counsel as a Strategic Asset and a Futurist, which is a very different role than companies have traditionally looked at the general counsel for. And this is a discussion that's by board members at the board level. And it's going to be about how do we as a board engage our general counsel in the strategy, and how do we take advantage of their abilities to contribute to strategy. Like many other things, this also does not work perfectly. There is an inherent tension. Almost half of general counsel say their ideal role is an executive role. That's what I really enjoyed the most about being general counsel. But only 8% say that's really where they spend their time. In fact, here is an interesting chart based on a survey done by the Gartner Group. It's a consulting company. I pulled this off their website. The top right corner is kind of the sweet spot where the general counsel is heavily engaged as a corporate executive. The bottom left corner is very tactical, where they're really focused on legal work product and technical work. In That bottom left corner is really what the general counsel should be delegating to people on their team. But you can see how much GCs get pulled down to the tactical, or what one business consultant or leadership consultant calls the whirlwind. You want to be up in that right-hand quadrant, but there are all kinds of things going on, all kinds of things going wrong, and you get pulled down to the tactical level to deal with them. That's an ongoing tension, and it's one that I think is now starting to get real attention, and may shift over time. I shouldn't be too optimistic. Now, I've talked a lot about working in-house. I want to circle back and talk a little more about working with outside counsel. The first thing to remember if you're in-house is that outside counsel are essential. We cannot do everything ourselves. There are very few companies, if any, that are big enough and have large enough legal departments that they do everything in-house. I think the biggest legal department I've been aware of from my reading and looking at the legal news is an international company that has about 1,000 lawyers in their legal department, which is bigger than a lot of companies. Even they use outside counsel. We use outside counsel not only for the volume of work, but for expertise. We can't know everything there is to know, and so we turn to people who focus in those areas. I've hired some lawyers who are extremely deep and narrow, who are very, very expert in very narrow, precise areas of the law and precise transactions. And I needed that because when I looked at that transaction, I thought, there's no way we're going to have time to figure this out on ourselves. And we really can't afford to get this wrong. So we go to the experts. The key is, as a general counsel, you need to learn what law firms and what lawyers to hire for what issues and which transactions. And that is as much art as it is science. Because no one law firm, no single lawyer is going to work for everything. And over time, you'll learn how to identify which folks you want to bring in and when. Part of that decision is getting outside counsel you can work with. Mutual respect is a key to that relationship. So you need somebody that you can work with and who will work with you and who will treat you as a teammate in addressing the issues you brought them in for. There were a couple times I got called on the carpet for how much I was paying for some outside counsel. I think it's rare that any CEO or CFO calls in general counsel and chides them for underpaying outside counsel or spending too little in their budget. But my response was, when I go to look for outside counsel, I don't look for the lowest hourly rates. I look for the value of the end product. And that means sometimes I need to bring in someone who's really expensive. And in the long run, that may actually be the least expensive way to get to where we need to be. That said, I didn't need high-priced lawyers for everything. So I worked with a range of firms, from some of the large national law firms all the way to the other end of the spectrum. I hired individual sole practitioners who worked out of home offices because there were things we needed, there's work we needed that they could provide for us, provide us a good, solid work product, and do it at a fraction of the cost of what other firms would. And so I worked that balance. I talked a little bit about working within the business unit. Litigation is a big one. Litigation is something that we almost always send to outside counsel because it needs specific skills, and there are times you need to put a lot of people on it. And in-house departments can't do that. We can't say, we're in a real crunch on this big lawsuit, So I need to hire and double the size of the department so we can all work on this. That's a key reason we use outside counsel for litigation. In my experience, we always paired in-house counsel with the outside litigators to work with them to make sure that the company was working with them efficiently and they were getting the right information that they needed, and also to manage the cost of litigation. Major transactions, it's rare that they're done completely in-house. I did mergers, acquisitions, divestitures where we sold companies we own. That was always a mix of inside and outside. I was talking a little earlier today about that. Early in my career, somebody told me, if you do a major transaction, like an acquisition, a merger, or you sell a sub, or you do a public offering, you won't get a full night's sleep for at least 4 months. You won't get a full night's sleep until it's done. And I didn't think much about that until the first time I did one. And I found I was waking up about the same time my business colleagues were, waking up hours ahead of the alarm clock thinking, how are we going to solve this? What about that? What if this goes off the rails? How are we going to get this much work done in so little time? And yeah, it was true. There are some high-stress times when the hours are long, the days are long, the nights are short, and you really look forward to it being done. So as I look back on all of that now, as I've finished the vocational part of my career, I'm looking back, there are some thoughts that I carry forward. The first is, if you are considering going into law, really give a lot of time and thought to what you're going to find most rewarding. And I would say, definitely do not just focus on the highest starting salary. Think about what works well for you, what fits well with your personality, with who you are, what would really give you a sense of satisfaction. Because no matter what you do, you're going to put a tremendous amount of time and effort into it for a long time. And if it's unrewarding, that will really wear on you. If you choose to go in-house, big question to ask yourself is, do you enjoy business? Is business interesting to you? Because once you go in-house, that's where you are. I would also encourage you to really think about the industries that are consistent with your values if you're going in-house. There are some industries I knew from the beginning I would not work in. I could not go there because of who I am and my values, and the values of those industries and the companies operating in them. And so I just took that out of the picture. And I would encourage you to really think about that. And finally, if you do go into law, either in a law firm or in-house, really think about the career path that will be most rewarding. You know, most lawyers are not laid back people. We tend to be type A's, we tend to be a bit driven, a bit goal-oriented, and sometimes too much so. I have to admit I was a little too much so during my career. But as you look at a career path, you really have to think about what will work for you. And if you look at advancement opportunities, you have to think about whether that will be rewarding. I really enjoyed going into management and executive roles. That meant managing people. Managing people can be the best and the worst of being in business. If it's something that you really don't enjoy, that may not be a good path for you. There are lawyers who choose not to go into managing roles who have very fulfilling careers, do a lot of good, and derive a lot of satisfaction. If you really do enjoy business, there may come a time when you'll have the opportunity to leave a legal role and go into a strictly business role, and you will no longer practice law. those are opportunities to really think about. If you have an opportunity like that, really think about how gratifying that would be and whether that's a good move for you. So I'll share these slides with Carl afterwards. I just tagged some resources on the end, some resources I have found quite valuable and which I think you may find valuable also. So that brings us to the end of me talking. Now I hope as you've listened to this, you found something there interesting, perhaps interesting enough to ask a little bit about, or perhaps something that you question, you're not quite sure is on the mark, and I would value that conversation.
You mentioned you work with mergers and acquisitions. Could you go into some challenges you face with mergers and acquisitions?
I'm sorry.
Challenges from the merger or acquisition?
Oh, okay, working with mergers and acquisitions, the challenges. Those are large transactions. They're high-stress transactions. The executives of both companies are personally affected by those deals. The shareholders of both companies are affected, so you have a lot of stakeholders and a lot at stake, and it really can raise the tension level. I think one of the big challenges, if you are acquiring another company, is to do a solid job of due diligence so you know what you're buying. I've seen several instances where companies acquired other companies and later found they got a whole lot of problems that they didn't know were there, and it became a real anchor to drag. There's a lot of negotiation in putting together the deal and the agreement. And that requires a lot of attention to the business details and the legal details. I mean, you will do draft after draft and round after round, excuse me, and you've got to watch all of that. And you're not guaranteed success. I had one divestiture we were doing where we spent 10 or 11 months working through the process. We negotiated everything. We were ready for the buyer. Buyer said they were ready to sign. We're expecting a signed acquisition agreement coming back to us, and their attorney called up and said they changed their mind. They're not doing the deal. I went in my office, closed the door, banged my head on the wall. I just said, okay, so that's 11 months of work. We're going to go back to the beginning, and we're going to start all over. And we did. We did eventually sell the company. But was that a little stressful? Was that challenging? Yeah, it was. On the other hand, when you get a good deal done, it's very rewarding.
So I know some students have to have some other obligations. I know Mr. Barnes is willing to stick around and continue to field questions. I don't want you to feel guilty about stepping out. I know some of you have to go. On behalf of Hope University, this is just a token of appreciation from the students. And you've seen me carrying it around all day, and now you get one of your own. So
Okay.
let's just give Mr. Barnes our appreciation. Stick around and answer questions.
I'll be around for any continuing conversation you want to have.